Hello everybody. It is June 5th, 2025 here in the United States of America. I apologize for the sound of my air conditioner running in the background. I hope that's not too annoying for everybody. It is about 86, 87 degrees here today. It's a little bit hot out, and I'd rather not be sweating to death while doing this video, so bear with me. Anyways, what I wanted to talk about today is the aftermath of the Ukrainian drone strike on Russia's strategic bomber fleet and its implications for foreign relations between nuclear-armed powers moving forward, specifically the United States and Russia. Now, as everyone may have heard by now, there was a drone operation carried out by Ukraine deep inside Russian territory, where a number of Russia's strategic bombers were damaged. Now, the mainstream American media is reporting that 41 bombers were destroyed. But looking into it further, it seems like the number is much less, and some of those bombers hit were actually parts planes that were no longer operational. Either way, it would appear that while this blow is certainly it certainly is a blow to Russia's strategic bomber fleet, it is not crippling. Now, several more blows like this would be crippling, but at least this one is not. From what I understand, Russia still has a fairly large number of bombers, Soviet-era bombers, left at its disposal that it could potentially use. As I mentioned before, the number does not appear to actually be 41. It appears to be less than 20, but I'm guessing, depending on where people are getting their information from, the reports are going to be conflicting with each other quite a bit. One thing I've noticed, though, about this war is the numbers given by mainstream media tend to be greatly exaggerated. They tend to greatly exaggerate Russian losses while underreporting Ukrainian losses. That has been the story of this war. So whatever you read in the MSN, take with a grain of salt. Your best bet, believe it or not, is to go on Twitter and find independent journalists and more independent news outlets that tend to do a better job at reporting the reality on the ground without explicitly really taking one side or the other. Now, some pro-Russian sites are vastly underreporting how many bombers were probably destroyed, and the ardently pro-Ukrainian sources are vastly over-reporting. So my guess would be the losses are somewhere in the middle. Now, Russia is part of the START, is a signatory to the START missile treaty that was actually signed in 2021 by Vladimir Putin and former President Joe Biden. Now, part of this treaty, from what I understand, states that nuclear-capable bombers must be more or less out in the open, outside of hangars displayed on tarmacs. My guess is so that each nuclear-armed power, specifically the United States and Russia, can easily keep track of each other's nuclear fleets. So if there ever was, say, a large amount of these planes took off for a location, the other country would know. It's sort of an insurance policy to say, if we're going to use our strategic nuclear bombers on you or your allies, you're going to know ahead of time, so it's an incentive not to do so. Now, Ukraine took advantage of this and struck these nuclear-capable bombers. And the issue is, if they indeed used American ISR and satellite imagery to locate these bombers, then that presents a pretty serious problem, and I would say would make this treaty null and void, and that Russia would, if it is proven that American intelligence was used in this attack, they would be right to withdraw from the treaty and make sure that their bombers are now placed in hardened hangars where they could no longer be struck. I mean, the entire treaty itself, I understand the point of it, but it just seems like a silly thing to sign or even adhere to. Several years into a war where Russia is fighting a country that is being supplied with intelligence and weaponry directly from the United States. Now, President Donald Trump has stated that he did not know ahead of time of this drone attack, this drone strike, and that he has had a phone call with President Vladimir Putin over this issue, which in his position he would need to do such a thing again, because if Russia does deem that the United States is responsible for providing the intelligence that carried out this attack, then the United States just majorly violated this missile treaty, and this could have some pretty long-lasting ramifications for all nuclear-armed countries. If the United States is seen as somebody who will sign a treaty such as this and then use a proxy to destroy those same bombers because they're left out in the open, then it would make it much more difficult for the United States in the future to sign any kind of nuclear treaty with, say, Russia or China, which may be to the United States' detriment, and also to put the United States long-range nuclear bombers at risk as well if they ever get into some kind of proxy war with a country that is being supplied by Russia or China. Then I would say that it would be fair game. So President Donald Trump is trying to get ahead of this to make sure that the United States government is not implicated in this attack. I can't imagine I can't imagine that Trump's administration would personally approve of this, considering that it is now trying to act as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. But the problem that Donald Trump faces is that the United States is seen as a co-belligerent in this war alongside Ukraine and the European Union. And what Donald Trump is trying to do is distance himself from Biden-era policies while also trying to keep the very pro-Ukraine members of Congress happy, and also he's trying to make it seem like he's not just outright abandoning an ally. Now, people wonder why. Well, if Trump wants out of this war and thinks it was a terrible idea, why doesn't he just pull out of it completely and leave Ukraine to its fate? Well, from Donald Trump's position politically, although that might be the easiest way to stop this war, politically that is not something feasible really for him to do domestically. America's allies would feel that, again, America has abandoned a country that it had promised to support and prop up, and would make diplomacy much harder in the future, and would upset quite a bit of our European allies, and also put Ukraine in a position where they may lash out directly against Western powers. This is a very real possibility that if Ukraine feels like it was left hung out to dry and walked into a war that it couldn't win and had all of its support pulled out from underneath it, well, then you're going to have a very large, angry group of militant nationalists with an axe to grind. And I'm sure Western powers are also trying to avoid that. So President Trump is going to distance himself from this attack as best he can. I would say, from the Ukrainian perspective, I understand why this was done. You are degrading the enemy's strike capability during a time of war, but also the problem is Russia and Ukraine are in the middle of negotiations, and an attack like this is a fairly major escalation. Attacking a nuclear-armed nation's nuclear-capable bombers 2,000 miles inside their own territory doesn't do well for negotiations. And I think from the Ukrainian perspective, they're trying to intimidate the Russians. You know, if you don't come to the table, look what we're capable of, look what we could do. But it would appear from the Russian side, the only thing that it did was it incensed the Russian government and the Russian people, and made any further negotiations much, much more difficult. As an American, I would say that if my country was in a similar position, where we were involved in a war with one of our neighbors, and that neighbor was basically being used by a proxy, as a proxy by Russia or China against us, and they had struck, say, our nuclear-capable fleet 2,000 miles into our territory, I don't think that would send Americans groveling to the table. It would just incense us. And so I don't really understand Ukraine's strategic mindset when it comes to this. The operation worked. It was fairly successful, although not quite as successful as it's being made out to be. It doesn't really seem to have achieved much of anything, and from what I understand, the numbers of planes destroyed was not nearly high enough to really hamper Russia's current campaign of missile and drone strikes against Ukraine. So, while yes, technically a successful operation, I don't think it achieved anything strategically. Now, this is an embarrassment to Russia for sure, but Russia was also abiding by an arms treaty that it had signed with the United States. So from the Russian perspective, it wasn't necessarily foolish to leave their planes out in the open. It was foolish to sign this missile treaty with the United States. It should have probably withdrawn from it immediately and put its bombers, long-range bombers, inside of protective hangars. Now, again, since Russia is trying to be diplomatic with the United States, pulling out of the START missile treaty would have been seen as a provocation, and maybe from the Russian side made dealing with the United States and negotiating with the United States much more difficult. But now it has lost several fairly irreplaceable planes because it had followed this treaty, and to really no benefit on their side. So I see in the future these treaties being much harder to implement and much harder to sign countries onto, now that it was taken advantage of to actually destroy long-range bombers. I think from a strategic perspective, treaties like this are foolish to sign onto. I understand the point to it, but leaving your valuable military equipment out in the open as a sign of trust to a nation that you are in a proxy war with, just again seems like a foolish idea. So I could see from this point forward the Russian position will towards the United States, or excuse me, towards Ukraine will probably harden. It'll be much more difficult to negotiate directly with the United States if it is seen to be responsible for providing the intelligence that helped to carry out this attack. And if President Trump wishes to, again, continue to play the mediator between Russia and Ukraine, then he would need to make sure that the American government is as distanced as possible from strikes such as these, and is not seen to be providing the intelligence that helps to carry out these kinds of strikes. Donald Trump will not walk away from this war, no matter how much he's threatened to do so. And when he does threaten to walk away, that's mainly to keep Ukraine in line. But President Trump needs to end this war while in office. He needs to be seen as the president that put a stop to this war, that ended this war. That way he can get the best possible results for himself politically. He won't be seen by his allies as abandoning yet another nation, and he won't be seen as the president who let Russia just do what it wants. I'm not saying that I would see him like that if he withdrew from this war, but many of our allies and some of his base would perceive him to be weak and pro-Russian. So that's what he's thinking about. So the pro-Russian side of the internet that thinks that President Trump is just going to walk away from this war and hand Russia the 4 oblasts that it wants in Ukraine are a bit naive. Again, I don't think that President Trump wants a war with Russia and wants this war to continue, but he has to straddle a very narrow political line, a tightrope, if you will, while trying to put an end to this war. But I think that's going to be a much more difficult task for him than he may have originally thought, because both Russia and Ukraine are in much more hardened positions than they previously had been, and for their own political reasons cannot just put a stop to this war where it stands currently. For Russia to achieve the things that it needs, it must force the Ukrainian military into capitulation and Kiev to acquiesce to its demands. And for Ukraine to achieve what it wants politically, it has to stop Russia where Russia stands, and to force Russia to make concessions towards it that I think Russia is never going to make. Ukraine seems to be holding out for some kind of collapse in the Russian government, collapse in the Russian economy, or Russia's military exhaustion. Those are the only ways that it's going to end this conflict on its terms. But again, that is based off a bunch of what-ifs that haven't happened yet. It's not going to be based off of a decisive military victory. It's more based off of just kind of waiting to see what happens and hoping for the best. So I think this war is going to continue on as it has been, at least for the next couple months. I think Russia will launch major strikes and a fairly large summer offensive. It probably is aiming to decisively end this war this year, or put Ukraine in a position where they're forced to finally come to the table. And Ukraine's goal is to, again, hold on as long as possible, inflict as many casualties on the Russian military as possible, and hope that Russia exhausts itself and then comes to the table. So it might be a case of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Which side will break first? I think the Ukraine side will break first, based off of its population, its economy, and the wariness of Western powers to continue this war. But again, Western powers don't want to hand a victory to Russia because of the investment they've put into this war. So I think it's going to continue on as long as possible until it's no longer politically feasible or even possible for the West to keep participating in this. But anyways, I'll be back on Saturday with another video. I hope all is well out there and everyone has a great day.